Lawmakers in Indianapolis returned to work this week. They're looking at making drastic changes to the school funding formula. This comes as schools around the state have shown deficits, especially after the state expanded charter schools and vouchers for private schools. To talk about it, we have Interim Merrillville Superintendent Tony Lux and East Chicago School Board President Jesse Gomez. I also want to make a quick note that later in the session, we're going to also talk to some folks from charter schools and voucher schools. But in the meantime, the school funding formula seems to have so many people upset at this point. Why are so many people unhappy? Let's start with Tony.
Well, the reason is because there's such a spread in terms of dollars per student in the general fund. The general fund was taken over by the state, funded by the state. And right now, there's a very broad range in dollars per student for a number of reasons, but that is the major concern.
All right. And I was in Indianapolis this week. I was able to talk to the governor and some of the legislative leaders. And it seems like the good news is that everyone wants to provide a certain amount more money for public schools. Are you concerned what's going to happen, though, to this school funding formula, that this could take away from an urban school district like East Chicago?
Well, that would certainly impact us negatively, in East Chicago, but I'm all for more money for public schools, however, not at the expense of the urban school districts, where we really need it for services that perhaps aren't as in demand as there are in other school districts.
So what happened? We used to be that some of the best well-heeled school districts were places like Munster and Valparaiso, some of these big suburban districts. But now these are the districts that are really showing some pretty sizable deficits. What happened?
Well, it goes back to when the state went from property taxes funding public schools to the state income tax and general tax funding public schools. So that changeover resulted in the state taking it over, but that was immediately followed by the economic recession. So the funding from income tax and sales tax dried up, which meant that the state then withheld something like $360 million from the budget for schools. No longer, and of course the wealthier schools back then always collected their property taxes. Poorer schools in poorer communities have continued to always have trouble to collect property taxes.
And so what's the solution here? Was that a kind of a failed experiment? Now the state, half of the state budget is now paying for schools. In the end, was that a good idea?
Well, not if there's no contingency to make, to have an insurance policy, so to speak, to level off changes in state revenue. Nobody foresaw the huge drop, and there was no contingency plan to ease the burden on everybody.
Are you concerned that that the state is considering? I mean, you hear a lot of talk of like there are a lot of suburban districts out there that are really lobbying to change this formula to provide a little more revenue. Are you concerned this is going to come from urban school districts? And is there a concern that the state has kind of given up on some of these school districts?
I hate to think that they've given up. We've made so much progress in East Chicago, for example, with the funds that we do have. Of course, we could always use more money, but I don't think that this should not be an either-or situation. We're all in this together, and so I would hope that any funding changes that are made with consideration that the additional duties that are required in school districts like East Chicago and to some degree even Merrillville.
What have you been able to do in East Chicago over the last couple of years? You're still a brand new school board there.
Yes.
You've got a new superintendent.
Right.
What have you been able to do?
Well, we've had to manage a budget that, we're at a $6 million deficit right now. And we've cut at least $1 million off that in our 6 months with Dr. Joe. We're going to continue to need to find ways to reduce our budget going into this coming year. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is educating our students, and it's going to be difficult if we have less money coming to us.
$6 million. Where's that deficit coming from?
A variety of places, Steve. Some of this was historical. I should put it that way.
Steve, part of the thing that people have to understand is the general fund is not the only source of income for school systems. There still are property taxes being collected to pay off debt, to pay for transportation, and to pay for capital projects, which is building renovation, improving schools, making sure that they're properly heated and taken care of. The tax caps cut across all types of communities, wealthy and poor, randomly, and affected and created tremendous losses of property tax revenue. When those deficits occurred, schools had to cover those deficits, like in debt service and transportation, out of their general fund money. So while it may be looked at that here's a poor community drawing $2,000 more per student in general fund, they may have lost millions of dollars to pay off debt service and transportation and have been shifting money from the general fund to pay those debts. So it is not a conversation that should be limited to just general fund, but all of school funding.
So what's the solution here? Would, at this point, allowing schools to make it easier for them to go to taxpayers again and to go back on the property taxes, is that the solution? Or with tax caps, is even that option really off the table?
Well, I don't know what, I think the legislature would not be inclined to make wholesale adjustments with property tax caps.
But they're going to have to do something.
Correct. And the thing is that they need to raise the foundation dollar amount that all schools get and find a way to ensure that you can't have too large a spread in terms of especially the bottom schools. Nobody wants to have a Hunger Games war of private schools versus public schools versus urban schools versus suburban schools fighting for these dollars. There has to be a limit on how much new ideas are expanded and some kind of floor level to have a contingency way to safeguard all public school systems.
What you're saying is the state needs to come up with more money.
Of course they do.
All right. Is there a real concern about how much vouchers, these private school vouchers and charter schools are taking? Jesse, is that part of your deficit up there?
It hurts just a little bit. Yeah, it does. We tend to lose kids at the middle school level and a little bit more at the high school level. But I go back to the results. You know, if we're looking at the facts and the results, that the charter schools are not performing as well. Yet there's a perception amongst the community that they are. Our scores in East Chicago are really good at the elementary level and improving at the upper levels. So there really is an opportunity for kids to come back to the public schools. And unfortunately, I think this legislature and governor is looking at taking more money, investing more money into charter schools and vouchers.
You do hear a lot about charter schools and private school vouchers, but they still represent a pretty tiny fraction of the amount of money the state spends on public education. Do you worry about it too much as a traditional public school?
I don't think we worry about it too much because the issue is further expansion and diversion of limited resources, limited tax dollars. Where do you want to have those dollars go to raise the achievement level of students? Investing more and more money into private schools is only going to students that are already high achievers. The schools that are addressing the needs of students not at grade level need to have their funds maintained, and they need even more resources to do that. And the same thing for our suburban schools who have dropped so low that they need to be brought up to some minimal appropriate level of funding.
And that's what we're going to have to watch as this process continues here. The General Assembly just started up this week, and they're going to have to make a decision by the end of April. In the meantime, this has been Interim Merrillville Superintendent Tony Lux and East Chicago School Board President Jesse Gomez. Thanks to both of you for being on.
Thank you.
Thank you.